Caplan, who is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University.
Yes. All right, let's get started. So, we've heard a lot of examples of cases where the crowd does well. Now, what seems interesting to me is to look a little bit harder for cases where the crowd does poorly. It turns out you don't have to look very far. How so? Well, it turns out the prediction markets, especially prediction markets for controversial subjects, are extremely unpopular. So it would seem that there's a case where the crowd is either right in terms of being able to do well with prediction markets, but if they're right about that, why is it the crowd then goes along and says the prediction markets are, in fact, a bad idea? The easiest example of this was the famous terrorism betting markets incident in the United States that my colleague Robin Hanson was closely involved in. This was a case democracy moved at incredible speeds. Within one day after the revelation that there was a proposal for a terrorism betting market, the program was canceled. One day. One day between the revelation and the cancellation. And it seemed very clear this was based upon the extreme unpopularity of the program. So once the senators found out about it, they say, hey, Americans will hate this idea. Never mind all of the evidence that this market actually will work very well with, and that the side effects are actually very unlikely to occur. Nevertheless, they played to the crowd, and the crowd said it's a terrible idea to rely upon the wisdom of crowds. Right, so that seems to be one counterexample that is very easily within our reach. And one of the things that I've done is look further for exceptions to what people in economics and politics call the miracle of aggregation, exceptions to the rule that the errors of the errors will balance out, and in particular that the errors of the uninformed will balance out, leaving the informed in charge. Right? So a simple example of this would be if you had 90% of people knew absolutely zero, which is more pessimistic than even I will say, and on the other hand, if 10% of people knew an infinite amount, which again is more optimistic than I think anyone here will say, it turns out that in at least an election with two candidates, that the candidate who wins will be whoever has the support, whoever has the support of the majority of the well-informed. So just to give you a quick example, normally in the United States, I give an election between the Unabomber and some normal candidates. You've probably never heard of the Unabomber. Since we're in France, I will give an election between Bush and some normal candidate. All right, so let us suppose that the uninformed are equally likely to vote for Bush or the normal candidate, in which case you have 45 percentage points going for Bush, 45% going for the normal candidate. However, again, as I think most people in France would think, no informed person would possibly support Bush. Therefore, when we do the division, Bush will get 0% of the informed votes, 10% of all 10 percentage points of the informed votes will go to the normal candidate, and the result is that we actually have 55% in favor of the normal candidate, even though 90% of people know nothing. All right, this is a somewhat stylized example of the miracle of aggregation, but I'll let it do for these purposes. All right, now what I wind up looking at in my work is for counterexamples to the miracle of aggregation, cases where it turns out that the average error is not zero or things do not actually balance out. And it turns out that there are three literatures that look at this and find very strong evidence that the miracle of aggregation fails, especially on some political questions, which are the main ones where people have looked. So just to give you the methodologies very quickly, first methodology is what I call the comparison to known fact. All right, this is where you get a question with an objectively right quantitative answer that you can get out of a statistical manual. For example, what percentage of its budget does the United States spend on foreign aid? Then you go and survey the American public, ask them what percentage do you think is spent on foreign aid, and see whether, in fact, the average error does balance out. When you apply the known fact method to determining whether or not the miracle of aggregation actually works, it fails, and it fails very badly on large questions. Right? So, for example, in the paper I go over one survey where it turns out that out of a list of 6 different topics, foreign aid tops the list of what Americans think is one of the 2 largest areas of the federal budget. In fact, it's about 1.2%. And on the other hand, Social Security, which actually is the largest single item in the federal budget, is near the bottom of the list of items that are chosen. Okay, so that's one approach. Now, of course, the limits of the known fact approach are that it is limited to very definite cut and dry things, which is why people in political science have turned to what is called the enlightened preference approach. This is an attempt to econometrically estimate what people would want if you raise their level of knowledge while keeping their other characteristics the same. All right, so the standard way that you go about this approach is you administer two different surveys. Survey 1 is a survey of objective political knowledge. How many senators does each state have? How many members of the U.S. Supreme Court you can name, and so on. Survey number 2, however, is a survey of policy preferences. Right? Should abortion be legal? Right? Should we have free trade? Should we rely more or less upon the free market? Questions like that. Okay, now, and then finally, of course, you want to go and gather some detailed demographic information, income, gender, race, anything that you might think would change what a person would want if he or she were informed. Okay, so basically what you wind up doing then is you estimate people's policy preferences as a function of all their demographic characteristics, anything you might think would be relevant, and also their score on this political IQ test, which is administered first. So the idea here is we want to find out whether, controlling for everything else, more informed people want different things. And if you are concerned about the possibility that, for example, highly informed poor people would want one thing, highly informed rich people would want the opposite, we can even do the estimation in such a way that we allow there to be a separate coefficient and a separate sign for every single subgroup. All right? So in general, when the enlightened preference approach has been applied, turns out that knowledge almost always matters. There is virtually no subject on which, holding everything else constant, raising the level of knowledge does not change the response that people have. There's some obvious cases like support for free trade, where controlling for all their characteristics, more knowledgeable people are more supportive of free trade. And then there's even questions like abortion, for example, where we see that holding all else constant, people who know more are more pro-choice. Which again, you may think that's very strange, but I would say it's not so strange at all. A more informed person might be more likely to consider how precisely do you plan to make abortion illegal, which is a hard question, which might change your mind about what policy you actually think is best. Right now, it's also worth pointing out, and Scott Aldhouse, in his excellent book, Collective Preferences in Democratic Politics, goes over essentially the entire universe of data that you can get on this question, all the work that's ever been done, shows that there are some strong patterns in terms of what more informed people want. Just very quickly, more informed people are generally more economically conservative and more socially liberal. Right, that is a quick punchline. And he also points out, contrary to people who emphasize the use of heuristics, which supposedly allow uninformed people or people with low information levels to reach very similar answers as their highly informed counterparts, that in fact that doesn't work. In fact, actually, when you look at the data, people that if you took a person and raised his information level up to a much higher level, he would not, in fact, continue to hold the same view. He's likely to change his mind and in certain predictable directions. Okay, so that's another approach that you might use for testing Miracle of Aggregation. Now, the last approach, which is the one that I rely on my work, is the comparison to experts, or maybe better put as a layman-expert comparison. All right, so this builds on the admittedly elitist assumption that when experts and laymen disagree, the experts are probably right. It's only a presumption in that I allow for competing explanations for the differences. For example, possibly experts think something different because their incomes are higher and they think that whatever is good for high-income people is good for the world. Possibly there's an ideological bias where experts all have one political view, and it appears that knowing more leads them to think something else, but it turns out it's just the political view that leads them in that direction. Again, what I wind up focusing on in my book is disagreement between economists and the public about how the economy works. So it's just one example, although I will say that it is a very important one. It's one where questions of economics intrude on almost all public policy questions these days. And it's also one the public itself generally ranks economic questions at the top of its list of concerns with terrorism and the war in Iraq for the U.S. that economics is sometimes at number 2, although sometimes it is still at number 1 even today. Right? So, and when we go and take a look at these two groups, and we also make controls for all the things that you might think would lead, for all the non-cognitive factors that you might think would lead economists to have distinctive views, it turns out that not only are there very large systematic belief differences between economists and the public, but moreover, controlling for a lot of non-cognitive factors does very little to make these differences go away. Okay, so any questions about that before I go on? And just to give you a very quick description of the broad outlines of the differences, probably the biggest difference should come as no surprise to economists, which is that economists are more think that the social benefits of the market mechanism are generally greater than the general public does. Right, so economists think that the market works better than the public does. Again, not just better in the sense of better for rich people, but they think this is actually controlling for income. So it seems to be actually a sense in which they think it works better overall, or from a social perspective. And I think that I will skip over some of the other differences, or just one other one. The public is much more anti-foreign than economists. Economists are much more likely to think that trade between countries is basically the same as trade inside of a country. The public, on the other hand, draws a very sharp distinction and tends to think that when other countries are trading with us, that something bad is going to happen as a result. All right, now, just from the fact that the Miracle of Aggregation fails, you couldn't immediately infer that democracies would tend to adopt bad policies. In particular, suppose that voters were selfish and had misconceptions about where their interests lay. It is then possible that the misconceptions could actually lead to better policy. For example, suppose there's a person whose self-interest lies in an antisocial direction. However, he has a misconception which makes him think that a socially beneficial policy is actually also in his private interest, and he's wrong. In this case, his misconception might possibly lead him to actually support a better policy for society overall than he would favor if he were perfectly informed. So at least that is possible. Again, it doesn't necessarily work out that way, but at least it's conceivable. However, this is where I appeal to a large literature in political science on what I call the self-interested voter hypothesis. Do people generally vote their narrow, objective self-interest? And it turns out that a very strong consensus among political scientists is that there's very little evidence of this. Occasionally, there are some examples where this happens. Sometimes there are some weak effects. But overall, there is a surprisingly large disconnect between people's material self-interest and what policies they actually favor and how they actually vote. All right, now, you might think this is an immediate cause for celebration for fans of democracy, but not necessarily. Here's the thing. If everyone is voting for the policies they think are best for society overall, and if there are deep misconceptions about which policies are in fact best for society overall, then their good intentions actually lead them to favor policies that have bad consequences. Right? So if there's someone who only wants to help you, but he thinks the way to help you is to amputate a healthy limb, he would be better off if he were selfish and wanted to be paid for it. On the other hand, if you were altruistic, said, no, you really need this, I don't need the money, and you're saying, no, stop. This is actually a case where it turns out that a combination of deep misconceptions with an altruistic orientation can actually be worse. Okay, so in fact, when you combine the evidence on the failure of the Miracle of Aggregation with the evidence on voters generally altruistic, or as political scientists sometimes call it sociotropic intent, then that does lead very naturally and fairly directly to a conclusion that democracies will in fact adopt suboptimal policy. Again, that's not absolutely clear, and in the book I discuss some of the exceptions or reasons why I think we actually do get better policy than public opinion would have you expect, although still quite a bit worse than you would hope. Okay, so now we get on to the part of the book that was intended for an interdisciplinary audience. So I originally presented this paper at the Social Philosophy and Policy Conference. So here's the interesting thing. People generally like to make utilitarian arguments in favor of democracy, or at least broadly consequentialist arguments in favor of democracy. But when you start pointing out the fact, and in fact the likelihood that democracies will and do adopt policies that are bad for most people, then people rarely say, oh, well, in that case, as a utilitarian, I'm going to drop my commitment to democracy. Instead, normally people will switch the line of argument to something else. Normally they will switch the line of argument from utility over to some kind of argument from autonomy. Okay? And the argument will go something along the lines of, look, just because the majority is wrong about what is in its interest doesn't mean that we shouldn't just allow the majority to vote for what it thinks is in its interest and let that happen. Okay? And you'll notice that there is a close parallel to arguments from autonomy at the individual level. Very often we see a person living his life poorly, and we may try to advise him, but he doesn't listen to us. And so when you say, well, I'm going to let him ruin his life, that's his right, I'm not going to interfere with it. So at least that is sometimes a reaction when there's a person who has false beliefs about how to best advance his interests, is we just go ahead and let him and say, look, he's wrong, but he won't listen to me, and I'm going to let him do what he wants, even though it has bad consequences. All right, and this is really quite similar to the argument that many people will offer after the utilitarian credentials of democracy are called into question, which is to say, look, yes, it may be that the majority is doing a very bad job of trade policy, they're protectionist, they're getting protectionist policies, but we should just stand aside and let them do it anyway, or we should try to persuade them, even though several hundred years of persuasion have so far not done all that well. Okay? Again, not to say that it's nothing, but still it's disappointing. Now, here there's a number of points that I make. First of all, it is striking that most people don't actually buy this argument from autonomy at the level of individuals for relatively extreme cases. So most people, other than a few libertarians, how many people are willing to say, look, the person is using heroin, it's bad for him, I know it's bad for him, he won't listen, I'm going to let him do it anyway. Okay, so, and in fact, you can take a look at how most democracies adopt a very long list of paternalistic policies. Of course, you have policies relating to things like narcotics, but also things like Social Security. Now, admittedly, that does combine a redistributive motive with a paternalistic motive, but from the fact that no one at all is allowed to opt out of Social Security, this shows us that there is some paternalistic motive going on. And indeed, in fact, when you go and push people on this question, in the end, normally they will say yes. It comes down to, I'm concerned that there are people who are too foolish to save for their old age, so I'm going to force them to do so for their own good. Okay, so it turns out then that at the individual level, people are not all that committed to autonomy. So I would say to them, if you're not all that committed to it at the level of the individual, why would you be so strongly committed to it at the level of the collective? Why shouldn't the same argument go through if democracies really are adopting policies that are quite harmful? What exactly would be wrong with overruling democracy if we had the opportunity? Also in the paper, I go over a number of arguments for why autonomy of the individual is actually more plausible and more deserving of respect than autonomy for the collective. So just to go over a few of them, one of them goes back to Robert Nozick's point that a collective has parts, an individual in some sense does not have parts. So when an individual says, leave me alone to go to hell in my own way, well, you say this person is ruining his own life. But on the other hand, suppose that you see a father abusing his child. And he says, look, let this family decide what this family wants to do. Don't be paternalistic. There is a case where the argument is much less plausible. You say, look, this isn't a case of the family doing what the family wants. It's a case of one person in the family immiserating another member of the family, and saying that we should leave the family alone is missing the point that actually part of the group is doing something bad to another part of the group. And I think we can make the same point in the case of democracy. If, in fact, free trade is better for most people, and the majority adopts it anyway, at minimum, people who are in favor of free trade and are suffering and say, wait a second, not only is this a policy that I don't favor, it's a policy that doesn't even advance the interests of the majority. So you might say that in a case where there is a genuine conflict of interest between the majority and the minority, you might at least say, look, well, we have to have some way of resolving this conflict. The majority should get its way, and it's unfortunate that the minority interests are overridden, but that's too bad. But in the case where the majority is wrong about its own interest, this seems to be a much more serious breach. Seems that in the first case you might say, look, we are overruling your prima facie right to be let alone because there are such large benefits being generated by doing what the majority wants. However, suppose that those benefits don't really exist. Suppose the majority would really be better off doing what the minority wants. That seems like a case where, in fact, the minority has a much more reasonable complaint in saying that the decision of the majority should be overruled. Okay, now, another point that's very much worth pointing out is that it is impossible to be consistently anti-paternalist at both the individual and the collective level. Why? Because collectives are paternalistic. So suppose that you see the collective voting for a policy to ban marijuana, saying it is in the best interest of society that we do this. Now, what is the anti-paternalist to do if he has the option of either banning the law, of either overturning this law or not overturning this law? Well, on the one hand, he could say, look, individuals have a right to use marijuana if they want to. That is their decision, in which case he's going to have to overrule the decision of the collective. Alternately, he could say, well, I'm going to allow the collective to be paternalistic, but in either case, there really is a choice of paternalisms and there's a choice of autonomies. And I would go back and say that since most of our intuitions about collective autonomy are really parasitic on individual autonomy, when there is a conflict between the two, say that individual autonomy wins, which leaves us with two options. Either we go with individual autonomy or we just drop autonomy arguments altogether. Now, finally, on the question of how we might actually improve upon democratic performance. Now, here, partly when I'm on the radio and have very little time to actually go over this, one of my favorite catchphrases is to say, look, at minimum, we need to do the same thing for democracy that we do with an alcoholic, which is to get him to admit that he has a problem. Right? It is useful merely to point out that just because most people think that something is true doesn't make it true. Just because most people favor policy doesn't make it a good policy. And that idea by itself is worthwhile getting out on the table. Right? So I would say that at minimum. But in terms of actually improving upon democratic performance, there are two different approaches. Okay, there's one that I think would work very well if tried, but is very unlikely to be tried. And there's another which is less effective, but is easy to do. Right, so first of all, the approach that could be very effective, but is unlikely to be tried, this is institutional change. And in the book, I go over a number of possible institutional changes, many of which I put out on the table to provoke. Right? So I think John Stuart Mill's proposal to give plural voting to college graduates has been mentioned. And I also dug up the obscure fact that until 1949, Britain had this. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but if you've ever seen the list of, in 1938, there were only 8 democracies left on Earth. Well, one of those 8 democracies had plural voting, at minimum. Possibly some other ones did as well. All right, so when you think about a number of different institutional changes that are possible, so I discuss, first of all, greater reliance upon the market, or in general, depoliticizing areas of life. So in the United States, there are a number of areas that are legally depoliticized. For example, there's the First Amendment prohibiting government involvement with speech or religion. Okay, so this basically is, this is an anti-democratic proposal in that it says the majority cannot limit religion or speech even if it wants to. Okay, so that's one possibility, is taking things out of the political arena. Another possibility is greater deference to experts, greater reliance upon experts. When I'm with economists, I mentioned the case of the Federal Reserve. So this is something where there is a substantial body that compares independent central banks with politically dependent central banks, and the strong conclusion is that the independent central banks have better performance overall by almost any standard. Okay. And then I also discuss more controversial changes like adjustments to the franchise. The mildest of these is to stop trying to get out the vote, to suspend efforts to increase voter turnout, because in general, one of the strongest predictors of voter turnout is education. More educated people have more reasonable views about policy. And if we were actually to get up to 100% turnout, the result would be that we would be reducing the economic literacy as well as other political literacy of the median voter, and politicians would have to cater to a lower level of understanding of the electorate in order to win. Right? So if you think that they are currently catering to a low level, it could be a lot worse. Okay, now, almost all these suffer from what I call a catch-22, which means that in order to get them, we would have to first convince the majority to do them. And if I'm right, that's going to be very difficult. So I just put those out there as worthy consideration, ones where if they could be adopted, it might very well be a good idea, but in practice it's going to be quite difficult. Then I turn to another set of options, which is much more feasible. In fact, I do it almost every day. This is just to take advantage of political slack. So, even in a very well-established democracy, there's almost always room for politicians, bureaucrats, government employees, and individual citizens to deviate slightly from what the majority wants, and sometimes more than slightly. Right? So, sometimes a president can adopt a policy. This is at least somewhat unpopular, thinking it's only one policy. I won't be thrown out of office for this. Sometimes bureaucrats will interpret laws in ways that are probably not what were really intended by politicians, but it has good results. Or sometimes a public employee like myself will be given a chance to talk to a university classroom, and will tell them that the majority of the members of the state that pays my salary are wrong about many things. Right? I don't think they want me to be doing this, and yet somehow they let me do this. I take this as an example of slack, where they're allowing me to do something that they would not actually want them to do. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. So what I say is there's actually many areas where there are opportunities for people to nudge policy in a better direction. And for example, I think that a plausible explanation for why the United States has as much free trade as it does is that there's actually an interest group that is very closely involved in the formation of trade policy, namely economists. And economists think that free trade is good. And they're right. And when they have an opportunity to interpret the law or otherwise to nudge policy in a more free trade direction, they do so. This is at least an important part of the reason why the United States is not a much more protectionist country. Again, if you go there and talk to Americans about this issue, you'll find that the level of protectionism is really quite shocking. Okay? So it is possible then, and in fact, that for people to use their slack in order to improve policy. And finally, what I say is, given the list of facts that I've given you, given the fact that the majority actually is often wrong and that errors do not balance out, given the fact that this autonomy argument doesn't really make a great deal of sense, in fact, we should probably applaud people who have slack in government, who use it in order to nudge policy in a better direction, and really there's no reason not to do it.
So I can give a quick summary of some of the things Bryan said in the course of explaining that I'd like to grant most of what he says. I agree with a lot of things Bryan says. In fact, I want to grant almost everything but his conclusions. So one methodological thing I appreciate a lot about this work of Bryan's is the frank recognition that privatizing things or turning them over to the market is, in one clear sense, taking them out of democratic control. I just think that's often elided in many discussions of these things. I think it's a vastly clarifying thing. I also agree with Bryan, though, that what's clarifying about it is not that we should obviously not do it because it takes things out of democratic control. I agree with Bryan that it's kind of a failure of, well, this is going beyond what Bryan says, but there's a lot of, Bryan does say this, there's a lot of so-called democratic absolutism in the culture, as if the value of democracy is a self-sufficient or self-evident first premise in all political theory. I think that's a big failing of contemporary political theory, really. It starts out with asserting democracy and asking what it would imply. But the value of democracy is subject to serious challenges, and it needs to be, they need to be answered, so I agree with that. So I want to grant a bunch of other things quickly and then move on to some concerns. So let's grant that the miracle of aggregation is unrealistic. Errors are very, very likely to have non-random or systematic aspects, so that's probably right. Grant that voters perform poorly on political quizzes. That's well established. Grant that voters often disagree with economists. That's beyond doubt. Grant that voters do not tend to vote self-interestedly. That's a kind of a twist of Bryan's, but it's great that he acknowledges the literature that suggests that people vote so-called sociotropically, not self-interestedly, but he uses that to his own purposes. Grant that there's nothing sacrosanct about letting everything be decided democratically. That's, I think, obvious, too. Grant that there's no good, I grant this, I don't know if everyone would, I agree with him, there's no good so-called autonomy argument for letting the people rule themselves. I think that's basically fallacious way of moral reasoning. In democracy, the group coerces the members. No member rules herself. So, but Bryan concludes from these things and others that a lot of important matters should be taken out of voters' hands in certain ways. One thing would be to turn things over to markets. Another would be to give economists and others extra votes. Pretty bold and radical proposal. And another is having a board of economic review of some kind over some issues, where there'd be a small panel of expert economists that have sort of binding review of certain kinds of legislation. Another bold and radical proposal. So here's some reasons for not thinking the things I granted lead to that conclusion. So first, do economists really know best? I'm not sure they don't, but I'm really not convinced what the answer is to this challenge. So what's the evidence for this? And Estlund points this out in her paper. It's crucial to Bryan's way of arguing that there are conditions that produce biases among people. And sometimes they're sort of hardwired or inborn, other times they're social, environmental. There's no more ripe conditions for bias than being surrounded by a bunch of colleagues that think the same kinds of things you do, right? So Bryan tells us that economists tend to be much more pro-market than the general population. And he takes this as evidence that lay people have an anti-market bias. But there's every reason to wonder whether they aren't subject to a pro-market bias. Now, I'm not sure it's all pro-market bias, but how would you correct for that? How would you control for that? How would you show it's not a pro-market bias? In fairness, I suspect there's just some truth to both of these. I suspect there's some pro-market bias. I also suspect there's some anti-market bias among the general population. Now, against the suggestion of pro-market bias, he points out that economists in the U.S., I think I have this right, but some result of this kind, that economists in the U.S. are more likely to be members of the Democratic Party than other people. Is that it? Or are there more Democrats than Republicans among economists? Just more than the average person, or the typical person. But that doesn't at all show that they aren't still biased in favor of markets. They might be less pro-market if they weren't surrounded by economists, whatever their party affiliation might be. It just shows, it contradicts something somebody might think. You might think they're all Republicans. Well, it turns out they're not. That doesn't begin to address whether they have a pro-market bias produced by their professional milieu. Second, does bad performance on quizzes measure the right thing? And Estlund touches on this in her paper and mentioned it briefly. I want to add one just kind of thought experiment that I find useful here. You know, people perform badly on these quizzes. A lot of people conclude that this is a strong reason for taking power away from the voters. But suppose you turn the fact checkers loose on parents. So you ask them things like, who's the superintendent of schools? Where did your kids teach or get their degree? How is AIDS transmitted? What's the germ theory of disease and what's the best way to prevent it? On and on and on. I've dug up some literature on this, and I think it would be no surprise. People do terribly. Parents do terribly on these things. What do we conclude from this? It's not at all obvious. What we conclude is this is some strong evidence that parents shouldn't be freely able to raise their own kids. And it can't be just because they have some right to raise their own kids, no matter how disastrous this would be. Of course, who's raising the kid is just as important as who's making political decisions. Right? A kid can be victimized by bad parenting. Thought experiment, different ways to think about why we're not as inclined to think or why we're not inclined to think this is a strong reason for taking what it might call free parenting rights away. So I suggest that poor performance on quizzes might, for similar reasons, not be any strong evidence for thinking democratic prerogatives should be taken away. Alen elaborates on that a little bit. Okay, third, and I'll just go over this quickly. This is partly relying on just some controversial views of my own, but there's a more general point. Even if economists do know best, what would entitle them to rule or to get more votes? I don't think the mere fact that somebody knows best is any direct argument that they should get to rule. So suppose that, in fact, my mom actually knows best. Would that bare fact entitle her to rule? I would say no, and you have to sort of ask what's getting in the way there. She knows best, why does she get to rule? But I think it's pretty intuitively plausible that she shouldn't get to rule. Why not is the question. I'm inclined to think the reason is that she might know best, but you don't think so. And you're mistaken, but you're a decent person. You're entitled, given certain things about you, you're entitled to justifications you can accept. This is echoing a point I made in my paper before. That's the way I would go. I would say, my mom might know best, but there's lots of reasonable disagreement about that. They're wrong, but that doesn't mean she just gets to rule them. Similarly, you could say, well, look, maybe the Pope does have a pipeline to God. So maybe he knows exactly what should be done. Does he get to rule just on that basis? I think, again, no. There are reasonable people, atheists and people of other religions and so on, who don't accept that he has a direct pipeline to God. And I think that would intervene, say, even though they're mistaken, that doesn't give them the right to rule them. So I think there's a tempting thing that I call the expert boss fallacy, as if you can move simply from X knows best to, obviously, X should rule. One very simple point is it just doesn't follow. Right? So the question, what principle is in between those two steps that justifies that step, or is there a principle that blocks that step? I think there's principles that block that step. Now, you might say, well, look, we all want to be guided by the truth, that's a powerful thought in favor of the expert boss move. And maybe economists or the Pope or my mom, it's really my mom, has some truths that others of us lack. But it also matters what the truth is about political authority. That's the way I like to put it. Of course, we love the truth. But there are truths about political authority that might actually block the expert boss move. Truth is truth. We love the truth. That one as well. So the wisdom of economists might be exaggerated. I'd like to hear what you think about that. Voter ignorance might be exaggerated by analogy with the parental poor performance. In any case, it doesn't look like knowing best in any direct way would entitle people to rule. A last thing, you might think that Bryan can still get all he wants by saying this would leave democracies the possibility of realizing these things and delegating things to markets or to economists and so on, and maybe that's all he wants. I don't think it's obvious that gives him all he wants, because I think he probably doubts that voters are as likely as economists to make the right decision about that. And I suspect he doubts on that basis that voters have the right to make that decision, although he's resigned to the fact that they probably will make it. So that's the move that would we'd want to confront with competing principles of political authority rather than risking making a simple expert boss fallacy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, David, for those comments. I'll just give a few replies so that we leave enough time for the audience. On the question of the trustworthiness of economists, here David anticipates an argument that I made the last time we were on a panel together, so I will repeat that argument, and then I will argue that it's actually a good argument. All right. So there's a question of, do economists suffer from a pro-market bias? I mean, one thing, just to make it clear, I wouldn't say that. There's some way you put it that I argue that because the public has. There was an exact phrasing that I won't worry about, but let's see. I mean, so the key thing that's found is that first of all there is this belief gap between economists and the public, but then I actually go beyond that and show that gap is robust to many of the non-cognitive explanations that people might favor. Right, so that by itself, I think, does at least a fair amount to undermine the idea that it is a bias on the part of experts rather than the public. In particular, there are two standard stories. One is self-serving bias, saying that economists just have these peculiar views because they're rich and they've got tenure and they're white and they're male, so on. Add on a number of other possible confounding variables. Another one is ideological bias, saying that economists just think these things because they're a bunch of right-wing Republicans. These are probably the two most common explanations or arguments given for why we should not trust economists. Those at least can be shown to be wrong, right? Because they are actually empirical, and I have the data, and they can be tested and shown that putting in all these control variables reduces the absolute size of the belief gap by no more than 18%, leaving about 82% on average still there. So that's quite large. Now, in terms of whether economists, I'd say that is at least a fairly good reason for thinking that the flaw is in the public rather than the experts, just that the standard non-cognitive explanations for why the experts have their distinctive views actually don't pass trial by data. Now, going further as to why I just don't believe the pro-market bias story is, as David points out, and as I've said, actually the typical economist is not a right-wing Republican. The typical economist is a moderate Democrat, more democratic and more liberal than the general public, and he still thinks that markets are much better than the public does. Moreover, I know, I don't have the data on this, but I know from experience that almost every moderate or liberal Democratic economist has been a moderate or liberal Democrat for his entire adult life, and often into a much earlier age. So really what happens is that someone who begins with left-wing values, studies economics, and changes his mind about how markets work. That is the standard pattern. Generally, they don't actually change the values. They rarely stop being liberal Democrats. Again, there's also other reasons for that, such as that Democrats are more pro-foreign, and this is something that inclines economists to like Democrats, or less anti-foreign. It's probably a better way of putting it. Okay, but say that just in terms of the biography of the typical economist, the fact that they start out very left-wing, learn some economics, and change their minds about many policy positions, although not their basic values, does actually do more than begin to address, to use David's phrase, this idea that economists have a pro-market bias. I think it actually presents very grave doubts against this idea that economists have fallen into a pro-market trap. In terms of the question of whether quizzes imply bad performance, this is actually the key point in the entire enlightened preference literature, which is to show that positions on quizzes, or that is scores on quizzes, predict things about policy preferences, controlling for everything else. So again, it's certainly logically possible that people who get high scores on quizzes have exactly the same policy preferences as people who get low scores on quizzes. For example, if it were all about values, facts didn't enter into the equation, that's exactly what we would expect. But that doesn't actually turn out to be the way the world works. In practice, people who get high scores on these quizzes have systematically different policy preferences than people who get low scores. And this is true even if you go and compare people to other people who are identical to them in all of the observable, or at least all of the observed ways. Let's see on this question of the expert boss fallacy. I think the way that I would put the argument, which is much easier to buy, is just we premise X knows best, conclusion we should do what X thinks. I think that is a very reasonable inference, one that is hard to object to. And then from that point, you may say, well, suppose we don't want to do what X thinks, then should X still be able to impose his will on this? That's where I would say, well, there's some utilitarian considerations, there's some autonomy considerations. Again, if what X thinks is actually preventing the majority from misguidedly suppressing the autonomy of the minority, then I'd say the autonomy argument, again, actually goes in favor of the expert. So, I mean, again, finally, in terms of parents, actually, I think that's actually a good case for applying a test very similar to the enlightened public test, which is to see, do more informed parents actually have systematically different parenting practices than less informed parents? What I would think is that even if you don't know very much about nutrition, you probably are not very likely to let your kids have lots of sugary snacks. Again, there may be some difference, and I'd be happy to consider it. And again, if this were just a question of what's in the best interest of the child, there I'd say, well, there is a presumption that people who know less should in fact do what people who know more think they should do. Again, there's also some countervailing concerns.
Okay, so a few minutes for a question. So if you can try to be concise, Jon.
I think it's important to take maybe a historical perspective on this and look at cases in which herding behavior among economists have led to a major crisis, like the role of economists in the Great Depression in many European countries, where absurd insistence on dogmas, not pro-market, pro-gold standard, led to vast amounts of pointless suffering. So any idea of institutionalizing the role of experts, and I would also include judges in the Restoration era, in the Lochner era, any idea of writing this in stone, the right of experts to overrule democratic majorities, I think might be more dangerous, a remedy more dangerous than a disease.
So there's a couple of things that can be said about that. First of all, if you are concerned about groupthink among experts, and I agree it's a serious concern, There are a number of intermediate positions between the absolute veto of experts and no say of experts at all, or only an advisory position. For example, you could have you need a majority of experts to overrule the majority, which is what we have for the Supreme Court. If you think that that is too weak, you need a 2/3 majority of experts, which would be likely, for example, to overrule protectionist measures, but not to overrule many other less controversial measures. In terms of herding behavior, I would say yes. Well, there's herding behavior among the public too. The public has often converged on some very deeply mistaken views. In the case of the Great Depression, I think it's interesting because, say, let's see. There were a number of cases where economists signed petitions during the Great Depression on what should be done. I think actually a very standard view was reflation, which actually was in fact, from a modern perspective, the right policy to take. I know that in Europe, especially in France, there was this issue with adherence to the gold standard long past the point where it would have made sense to go off it. So yes, mistakes will be made. So the relevant comparison is, of course, which is over the long run and overall, which winds up doing better. And again, if you are concerned about groupthink or experts running off the rails, there are plenty of intermediate positions between experts have only an advisory capacity and experts have an absolute veto. And again, finally, as I said, I think David makes too much about the institutional fixes that I propose precisely because I don't think they're likely to happen. Right? If we could persuade the public to give an economist a veto over economic policy, I think we could just persuade them to adopt better economic policy, and we wouldn't need to do the institutional fix. Although again, you might possibly want to lock it in for the benefit of future generations. But rather again, in terms of what practically can be done, this is taking advantage of slack. This is something that I think is already going on, but I think that to some extent experts feel guilt about exercising their slack because they think that they are doing wrong in going against the majority will. And I'm suggesting if actually experts are right, then we should thank them, although quietly, so perhaps the public doesn't hear.
Jerry?
Thank you. So, Bryan, you're shifting a bit, I think, in the right direction. When I got your book, as I told you yesterday, I looked in the index for the term representation, missing. Same with Fernando Teyson and Rational Choice and Deliberative Democracy about many of the same issues about voter incompetence. Looked in the index. There's nothing in that book about representation. And even Estlund, in this chapter, it's as if we live in a direct democracy, not a representative democracy. And representation and bureaucracy were and are intended as information-improving devices. Sayez talked about representation as an instantiation of Adam Smith's division of labor, and the trick is to make these agents faithful by repeated election. I think on informational grounds, I have a motive. It's easier to justify representative democracy than direct democracy. Second, and it's short, comparing economists' views to public views on national policy, I suggest a proper. And you say that economists' views are probably more right than voters' views. But let's do another comparison. And because of that, we should turn things over to the market. Let's do another comparison. Let's compare economists' views about consumer choices and then compare those to actual consumers. Mm-hmm. Then we're doing proper institutional comparison. And I surmise that economists' views on prudential consumer choices will be better than those offered by actual consumers.
Bryan, would you mind if we gathered all the questions first?
Sure.
That might save some time. So, Adrian.
Thanks, Bryan. I had maybe a small clarifying question about your initial example that might then expand out. In the initial example, you tried to show that there was some internal tension in the wisdom of crowds because the wisdom of the legislative or democratic crowd overrode the prediction market, which embodies the wisdom of the market crowd. But I didn't see even any prima facie tension between those two things because the two crowds are just asking different questions, right? The prediction market crowd is trying to make accurate predictions about X, and the legislative crowd is trying to ask whether it's desirable overall to have this prediction market, right? This is something Karen and I were talking about yesterday. So there's not even any tension between those two things. They might both be quite correct about their different questions. Then I wonder if you could run that through some of your other findings. I don't know the details, so this might just be wrong, but is it the case in some of your findings that different questions are being asked, that economists are asking, for example, whether a policy is efficient, and democratic majorities are asking whether it's desirable overall, where efficiency might be one consideration but wouldn't exhaust the total set of considerations? And if that were true, then again there wouldn't be any even prima facie contradiction between the two things.
Actually, Helene, could I answer that one? I want to make sure I do not forget this one. Let's see. I mean, you're right. You're certainly right that logically speaking, there's not necessarily a tension. So on the one hand, you have the prediction markets trying to estimate the probabilities of terrorist attacks. On the other hand, you have the legislature deciding whether this is good. The connecting premise is that it is good to find out what the probability of a terrorist attack is and what is more likely to, what will raise that probability and what will reduce it. And in fact, if you go and read the statements of the senators who came out against it, as well as the arguments involving it, they were along the lines of this is a silly method of gathering information. This is just a parlor game, and will encourage terrorism. So there were actually specific objections made about whether or not this was an effective method of gathering information, whether it was actually an effective method of accurately gathering information.
Because I followed this too. I mean, that's a selective account. I mean, that was one type of objection that was given. Another type of objection that was given was just this is immoral overall on some broader conception of the good.
Right.
So of course it's good, ceteris paribus, to have accurate predictions, but the ceteris aren't paribus. That's the suggestion.
All right, well, I'll leave that there. And then just on the question of, is it possible that economists and the public were either answering different questions or answering the questions in different ways? Of course, that's always possible. I will say a few things. First of all, the question, these questions are generally about policy preferences. So, this is just asking people what policy should we have, and trying to predict it as a function of characteristics and a score on a political IQ test. Here, the questions that I looked at were basically all descriptive questions about how the economy works. And normally, while, again, this is ordinary English, so that's understandable to most people, so they're trying to avoid jargon, but normally they would say things like, is it good for the economy, that? Which, again, that still does leave some ambiguity, but at least a substantial effort was made in order to alleviate the ambiguity. And also, I'd say that there are some questions that are that are less ambiguous than others, and on the questions that are less ambiguous, there isn't a tendency for the public and economists to be closer. So again, certainly, there's always some room for doubt along your lines, but I think the people who constructed the survey, they were not me, by the way, did make a pretty serious effort in order to get past purely linguistic differences.
Okay. I want to push you harder on this point. So I take it your conclusion is that because majorities under-promote utility, their rules should be abrogated. In some cases.
Yeah.
All right.
Or at least the argument for not doing it is weaker than otherwise believed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you would have to deny one of three premises to hold that conclusion, all of which I think are very strong arguments could be given for. The first is that, okay, let's call justice what we have most reason to do. And the first premise is that justice includes some content that is egalitarian or deontological. I mean, what we have, what we owe to each other. And both of those, that content militates against utility. The second premise is that when voters go to the polls, they aren't making a judgment about what's in their interest, but they're making a judgment about how that content is specified, what that content is. And the third premise is that voters are reasonably good at doing that. So I think those three premises give the broadest view of an epistemic argument for democracy, and I think that you have to deny one of the three.
All right, I'll deny three. Right, voters are not reasonably good at doing this. I'd also say that if you're following my arguments on 4, I'm actually straying into the realm of deontology to some extent when we're discussing autonomy. So there, for example, I was considering the semi-deontological view that the majority has the right to advance its own interests and to override the interests of the majority if, in fact, it really is doing that. Right, but considering that still the minority has a prima facie right to be left alone if, in fact, what the majority is doing isn't benefiting the majority. So, I would consider that at least to be semi-deontological. So, I'd say, deontology can cut both ways. So you could also say there's a duty for people not to make decisions when they don't know what they're doing. It seems like a very plausible duty. So, think on deontological grounds, you could wind up getting some value out of this.
Yes, very short. Jon is right. There is no way to claim that experts are always right. But unfortunately, there is no way either to claim that popular majorities are always right. That's a set conclusion, but I think it's wise to think so. It's a fact, on the other hand, that experts play more and more a crucial role in our society. Not only we are expert and we teach in elitist institution and we care about expertise, I suppose, because we teach exactly in those institutions. But in reality, there are two types of experts.
We teach humility.
Well, but to people who pay a lot and being professor getting a lot of money, and I'm not sure that you would like to teach in Arkansas. So my point is that there are two types of experts. Experts making decisions autonomously, the Federal Reserve Board or the Supreme Court, and expert advising politicians. So many decisions are still made by people which in a sense are not experts. So it would be interesting to distinguish these two types of people, either making decisions because they are expert, period, or just advising others. It's not a question, it's a question for us. Thank you.
So let's see. So going back to Jerry's question on a comparison of economists' views of consumer behavior, that's a great question. It's been done to some extent. So actually in behavioral economics, a lot of what's actually studied is ways in which consumers deviate from normative economic rationality. Okay? And many economists have used this as an argument for why we should have regulations in order to push people in the direction of doing what is in their own best interest. And by itself, I'd say that is a perfectly fine utilitarian argument. But the only thing that I want to interject is, hold on, before you actually go ahead and put this in, realize that it's going to be the regulation is probably going to be based more upon what the public thinks is wrong with the public, rather than what economists think is wrong with the public. And in many cases, it turns out that what the public thinks is wrong with the public is the opposite of what economists think is wrong with the public. Just to give you one example of some interest, one very common finding in behavioral economics is that people underuse reverse mortgages. A reverse mortgage is a financial instrument where basically, if you are 60 years old and you want some cash and you own your house, you go and tell the bank, you will give me a payment every month as long as I'm alive, and when I die, you own my house. Okay. Now, the standard conclusion of a behavioral economist is this is a great financial instrument, especially for someone who has almost all their wealth in their house and otherwise has very little income. And yet, there's a lot of paternalistic regulation that aims to do what? Stop people from getting reverse mortgages, because most people think that only a fool will do it. And they're wrong. It turns out, actually, it's only a fool would think that only a fool would do it. It's actually a good idea to do it if you are in the situation. Right. So again, certainly your suggestion is very good, and so Richard Thaler has a very good piece on the Swedish retirement system, and when the Swedes were given a choice, turned out that the default option was better than most of the choice the people made. Although I will say that the Swedish default was the best default in the history of retirement systems. Most countries have far worse defaults, or they don't just have a fault; they have a mandatory system that is poorly done. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Let's see.